The forest was alive with the hum of cicadas, their endless rhythm filling the warm air with an eerie tension. Valtor pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, his eyes scanning the undergrowth as his horse picked its way along the overgrown path. He had no destination in mind, only the distant hope of finding peace in a world that had long since forgotten the meaning of it. The smell of smoke reached him first, a faint, acrid tang that carried on the wind. His instincts sharpened immediately, the old soldier in him rising to attention. He dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch. Drawing his blade, he moved forward, his boots silent against the forest floor. The trail was fresh, the broken branches and trampled grass leading him toward a clearing. As he approached, the trees parted to reveal the remnants of a small village. Huts were burned to the ground, their charred skeletons jutting out like the bones of a great beast. Bodies lay scattered, and the air was thick with the stench of death. But it wasn't the ruins that caught his attention. It was the sound, a faint, almost inaudible whimper. It was coming from one of the cages near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the remains of a collapsed building. He moved closer, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. The cage was crude, made of rusted iron bars, and inside was a figure slumped against the corner. Walter's breath caught. It wasn't human. She stirred as he approached, her ears twitching slightly. The fur covering her body was matted with dirt and dried blood, her tail limp against the cage floor. Her face was angular, otherworldly, with delicate features framed by fox-like ears that flicked toward him as if sensing his presence. But it was her eyes that held him, their golden hue, sharp and filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. She was no mere animal. She was a demi-human, a foxwoman, and by the looks of her condition, she had been treated worse than a beast. "Who did this to you?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hands, slender and clawed, gripped the bars weakly, as if even that effort was too much. The faint sound of voices in the distance snapped Walter's attention back to his surroundings. Slavers. He knew their type, the cruelty, the greed. The thought of leaving her there was a temptation, but only for a moment. Valtor had seen too much suffering in his life to walk away now. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, more to himself than to her. She blinked, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Hope, perhaps, or maybe disbelief. Either way, he wasn't about to waste time. Using his sword, he pried the lock loose, the old metal giving way with a groan. The door swung open, but she didn't move. Her body was trembling, weak from what must have been days without proper food or rest. He knelt in front of her, his tones soft but firm. "Come on, you have to stand." Her ears flattened slightly, and she tried to rise, but her legs gave out beneath her. Without hesitation, Valtor slid his arms under her, lifting her effortlessly. She weighed little, her body surprisingly warm despite her condition. Her fur brushed against his skin, soft in places where it wasn't marred by injuries. She let out a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a whimper, but didn't resist. The voices grew louder, and Valtor cursed under his breath. He carried her back toward the trees, keeping low and moving swiftly. His heart pounded as he reached his horse, glancing over his shoulder to see the first figures of the slavers emerging into the clearing. He hoisted her onto the saddle, her body slumping against the horse's mane, and climbed up behind her. "Hold on," he whispered, though he doubted she had the strength to do so. He wrapped one arm around her waist, steadying her, and urged the horse forward. The slavers shouted in alarm, their cries ringing out as they spotted the fleeing pair. The chase was immediate. Valtor pushed the horse harder, weaving through the dense trees as arrows whistled past them. The girl stirred weakly in his arms, her head lolling against his chest. She was too fragile, her breathing shallow and uneven. He tightened his grip, his mind racing. They broke through the thickest part of the forest and into a narrow ravine. The walls rose high on either side, providing temporary cover. Valtor slowed the horse, glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. The slavers were still behind them, but the gap had widened. Finding a small alcove in the rock, Valtor dismounted, pulling the girl down with him. She clung to him instinctively, her claws grazing his shoulder as he settled her on the ground. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his for a brief moment. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice low but steady. He tore a strip from his cloak, using it to bind one of the deeper wounds on her arm. She winced but didn't pull away. Instead, she watched him intently, her golden eyes piercing through the dim light. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Baltor paused, his hands stilling for a moment. He wasn't sure he had an answer. Maybe it was guilt or a sense of duty. Or maybe it was something about her, the way she carried herself even in such a broken state. "Because someone has to," he said finally. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for something, truth, perhaps, or motive. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, and she relaxed slightly, her head resting against the cool stone. The sound of distant shouts brought Valtor back to the present. They weren't safe yet. The slavers were still hunting them, and time was running out. He glanced down at the girl, her breathing steadier now but still weak. "We have to keep moving," he said, his tone gentle but firm. She nodded faintly, her trust in him growing, though unspoken. With the slavers closing in, Valtor helped her to her feet, his mind already racing with plans for their next move. The forest closed in around them as Valtor guided the girl through the twisting paths, his arms steadying her whenever her legs faltered. She was weak, her steps unsteady, but she made an effort to keep up, her golden eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. The slavers were still out there, their distant shouts echoing through the trees. Every sound, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves, set Valtor's nerves on edge. "We'll rest soon," he assured her, though his own body ached with fatigue. She glanced at him, her ears twitching as if gauging the truth of his words, but she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. Years of mistrust and survival etched into her every movement. Yet she clung to his side, her claws lightly brushing his arm whenever she stumbled. The sun dipped lower, painting the forest in shades of amber and shadow. Valtor led her toward a small stream he had spotted earlier. The water gurgled softly over smooth stones, a soothing sound amidst the tension. He knelt by the bank, guiding her down beside him. She hesitated, her tail curling protectively around her body, but the lure of water proved too strong. "Drink," he said gently, cupping his hands to demonstrate. She followed his lead, leaning forward to lap at the water with an almost animal-like grace. For a moment, her guard slipped, and Valtor caught a glimpse of something more. Someone who had been forced to survive, stripped of comfort and dignity. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small piece of dried meat. "Here," he said, holding it out. She sniffed it cautiously before taking it from his hand, her claws brushing his fingers. Her gaze lingered on him as she chewed, a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Who are they?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had spoken since their escape. "The slavers." Valtor's jaw tightened. "They hunt anything they can profit from. Gold, power, people." He studied her, noting the way her ears flattened at his words. "You've dealt with them before." She nodded, her eyes distant. "They took my clan, my family." Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself quickly, her defiance returning. "I was too small to fight then, but I swore I wouldn't let them win." Valtor frowned, sensing the weight of her words. "And yet they caught you again." Her gaze sharpened, her tail flicking behind her. "They didn't catch me. I let them take me." The revelation stunned him. "Why?" "They had others," she said, her voice heavy with pain. "Children. I traded myself for their freedom." Her words struck Valtor like a blow. He had seen sacrifice before, on the battlefield, in the eyes of soldiers who knew their lives were the cost of victory. But this was different. This was raw, personal, and unbearably human. "You're braver than most men I've known," he said quietly, his voice laced with admiration. She blinked at him, surprised, but said nothing. The sound of snapping branches jolted them both. Valtor stood instantly, his hand on the hilt of his sword. The girl scrambled to her feet, her ears swiveling toward the noise. He gestured for her to stay low, but she crouched beside him instead, her movements silent and deliberate. Two figures emerged from the underbrush, scouts, by the looks of them, armed with short blades and bows. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Walter's hand tightened on his sword, his heart pounding. He motioned for the girl to stay put, but she shook her head, her gaze locked on the approaching men. Before he could stop her, she moved. Her movements were swift and fluid, a blur of fur and grace. She pounced on the first scout, her claws raking across his arm as he cried out in shock. The second man turned, raising his bow, but Valtor was already there, his blade slicing through the air. The man crumpled, his weapon falling uselessly to the ground. The first scout struggled beneath the girl, his shouts turning to whimpers as her claws pressed against his throat. Valtor placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. Enough. She hesitated, her breathing ragged. Slowly, she released the man, who scrambled backward before disappearing into the trees. Valtor watched him go, his gut twisting. They had bought time, but not much. You didn't have to kill him, she said, her voice softer now, almost contemplative. And you didn't have to spare the other, Valtor countered, wiping his blade on the grass. But you did. She didn't respond, her gaze distant as she studied the blood on her claws. He reached out, his fingers brushing her fur lightly. The gesture was brief but intentional, a silent reassurance. She looked up at him, her golden eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. We need to keep moving, he said, breaking the moment. She nodded, falling into step beside him as they left the stream behind. As night fell, the forest grew colder. Valtor found a small hollow beneath a cluster of trees, its walls thick with moss and vines. It wasn't much, but it would serve as shelter. He gathered wood for a fire, keeping it small to avoid drawing attention. The girl sat nearby, her tail curled around her legs as she watched the flames dance. You never told me your name, he said, breaking the silence. Mira, she replied, her voice soft. And yours? Valtor. She nodded, repeating the name quietly as if testing it on her tongue. There was something almost intimate in the way she said it, her voice carrying a warmth he hadn't expected. As the fire crackled, Mira shifted closer to him, her fur brushing against his arm. He glanced at her, noticing the way her eyes reflected the firelight, their golden hue captivating. Her movements were deliberate, her proximity intentional. He could feel the warmth of her body, her presence grounding him in a way he couldn't explain. You're different, she said suddenly. Most humans wouldn't have stopped to help. Most humans wouldn't have seen what I saw, he replied, his voice low. Strength, courage. You're more human than most people I've met. She smiled faintly, her ears flicking forward. You say that now. Wait until you really know me. Her words carried a teasing edge, but there was vulnerability beneath them. Valtor held her gaze, his hand brushing hers as he reached to stoke the fire. The touch lingered, unspoken understanding passing between them. Get some rest, he said finally. We'll need our strength for tomorrow. Mira hesitated before lying down, her head resting on her arm. Her tail curled protectively over her body, but her breathing was steady now, her tension easing. Valtor leaned against the tree, his sword within reach as he kept watch. The night was quiet, but he knew the danger was far from over. As the firelight cast flickering shadows, he glanced at Mira, her sleeping form illuminated in the soft glow. She was a mystery, fierce, vulnerable, and utterly unique. And though he wouldn't admit it, she had already begun to stir something in him, something he couldn't ignore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had this fragile moment of peace. The early morning air was crisp, dew clinging to the grass and the faintest hint of sunlight filtering through the trees. Valtor stirred from his position against the tree trunk, his muscles stiff but his instincts alert. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only the faint scent of smoke lingering in the hollow. He glanced at Mira, who was still curled up near the embers, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her face was softer in sleep, the tension and guardedness of the previous day momentarily absent. Valtor watched her for a moment longer before shaking himself free of the thought. There was no time for sentiment. The slavers wouldn't give up so easily. Mira, he said quietly, moving to crouch beside her. She stirred, her ears twitching before her eyes opened, golden and sharp despite her evident fatigue. We need to move, he continued. The slavers won't stop hunting us. Mira sat up, her tail flicking behind her. She stretched carefully, wincing slightly as her movements pulled at the injuries still healing beneath her fur. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion he could see in her posture. Valtor nodded, offering her his hand to help her up. She hesitated briefly before taking it, her claws lightly grazing his palm. The touch was brief but sent a flicker of awareness through him. He quickly turned his focus back to their surroundings. They set off through the forest, keeping a brisk but cautious pace. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into the hills, the undergrowth thick with brambles that snagged at their clothes and fur. Mira moved with a quiet grace, her steps almost soundless, but Valtor could see the strain beginning to wear on her. Let's take a moment, he said after an hour of steady travel, gesturing to a cluster of rocks that formed a natural resting place. Mira sank down gratefully, her tail curling around her legs as she leaned against one of the larger stones. Do you think they'll catch us? She asked, her voice quieter than before. Valtor shook his head. Not if we keep moving and stay smart. They're greedy, not disciplined. They'll spread out to cover more ground, and that's when they'll start making mistakes. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. You sound like you've done this before. He gave her a wry smile. I've spent my life in battles. Avoiding them is just another kind of strategy. Mira tilted her head, studying him. Why did you stop fighting? Valtor hesitated, the weight of her question pulling at memories he had tried to bury. Because the cost was too high, he said finally. I lost too many people I cared about. I couldn't keep fighting for causes that didn't feel worth it anymore. Her ears flicked back slightly, her expression softening. But you still fight. For me. That's different, he said, meeting her gaze. You're not a cause. You're a person. Mira looked away, a faint hint of color rising beneath the fur on her cheeks. The vulnerability in her expression was fleeting, quickly replaced by the determined mask she wore so well. We should keep going, she said, standing before he could respond. The hills gave way to a narrow valley, its walls steep and covered in thick moss. A stream wound through the center, the water sparkling in the midday sun. Valtor paused at the edge, scanning the area for any signs of movement. It seemed quiet, but he knew better than to trust appearances. This way, he said, leading Mira toward the stream. They followed its course, the sound of rushing water masking their footsteps. Mira moved closer to him as the valley narrowed, her ears twitching at every distant rustle or crack. Do you think they're close? She asked. Hard to say, Valtor admitted, but we can't assume they're far. The path along the stream became rocky, forcing them to slow their pace. Mira stumbled once, catching herself on a nearby boulder. Valtor reached out instinctively, his hand resting lightly on her arm. She froze for a moment, her eyes meeting his. You okay? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, her gaze lingering on him before she pulled away. Just tired. Valtor frowned. We'll find somewhere to rest soon. You're still recovering. Mira opened her mouth to argue but closed it again, seeming to think better of it. She followed him in silence as the valley widened into a small clearing. The stream pooled here, forming a shallow basin surrounded by wildflowers. This will do, Valtor said, setting his pack down near the edge of the water. Mira hesitated before joining him, her movements slower now. She knelt by the stream, cupping the water in her hands to drink. The sunlight caught the golden tones of her fur, making her look almost ethereal against the backdrop of the forest. Valtor forced himself to look away, focusing instead on checking their supplies. "You're staring," Mira said suddenly, her tone teasing but with an undercurrent of curiosity. Valtor glanced up, unbothered by her accusation. "Just making sure you're not going to collapse again." Her lips twitched in a faint smile, but she said nothing more. Instead, she stretched out on the grass, her tail flicking lazily as she closed her eyes. "You know," she said after a moment, her voice softer, "this is the first time in years I've felt safe." Valtor sat down a few feet away, his sword resting across his lap. "It won't last," he said, though there was no malice in his tone. "But I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." Mira opened one eye, her gaze sharp despite her relaxed posture. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, the strength hidden beneath her vulnerability, the fire that still burned in her despite everything she'd endured. "Because you deserve it," he said finally. Myra's ears flicked forward, her expression softening. She sat up slightly, her gaze searching his face. "You're different," she said again, echoing her words from the night before. "Maybe," Valtor said with a faint smile, "or maybe you just haven't met enough humans." Her tail swished behind her, and she gave a soft laugh, quiet but genuine. It was a sound Valtor hadn't realized he needed to hear until now. The moment stretched between them, fragile and unspoken, but the distant echo of voices shattered it, pulling them both back to reality. Valtor stood immediately, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "They're close," he said, his voice grim. Mira rose beside him, her posture tense but ready. The peace they had found was fleeting, but it had been real. And as they prepared to face the next challenge, Valtor couldn't help but feel that he had already found something worth fighting for. The voices drew closer, low murmurs and the occasional snap of branches breaking the quiet of the clearing. Valtor motioned for Mira to stay low, his gaze scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The slavers had picked up their trail faster than he'd expected. They were hunting now, moving in a deliberate, methodical pattern. Mira crouched beside him, her claws lightly brushing the ground as her golden eyes darted toward the sound. Her breathing was steady, her movements controlled, but Valtor could feel the tension radiating from her. She wasn't afraid, she was ready to fight. "There," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pointed toward the underbrush, where the faint outline of a figure moved through the shadows. Valtor nodded, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Myra's ears flattened, her expression sharp. "I can fight." "I know you can," he said, his tone firm but calm. "But they'll expect that. Let me draw their attention." Before she could argue, the first slaver stepped into the clearing. He was a wiry man with a cruel smile, a dagger in one hand and a whip coiled at his side. He froze when he saw Valtor, his eyes narrowing. "Well, well," the man drawled. "Looks like the runaway has a new protector." Valtor didn't respond, his sword already drawn. The slaver took a step forward, his smile widening. "You've made a mistake," the man continued, his tone mocking. "That one's worth a fortune. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you walk away." Mira bristled at the words, her claws digging into the dirt. Valtor stepped forward, blocking her from the man's view. "You'll have to kill me first," Valtor said, his voice cold. The slaver's grin faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Your funeral." With a sharp whistle, he signaled to the others. More figures emerged from the forest, their weapons glinting in the dim light. Valtor counted 4 in total, all armed and moving to encircle them. He glanced over his shoulder at Mira, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said. The first slaver lunged, his dagger aiming for Valtor's side. Valtor sidestepped easily, his blade flashing as he parried the strike. The sound of metal clashing filled the clearing as the fight began in earnest. Mira moved to his side, her claws slashing at another attacker who came too close. She was fast, her movements precise, but Valtor could see the strain in her limbs. She was still recovering, her strength not yet fully returned. Another slaver charged at Valtor, swinging a crude axe. Valtor ducked beneath the swing, his sword finding its mark in the man's side. The slaver cried out, collapsing to the ground. Behind him, Mira grappled with her opponent, her claws locking with his weapon as they struggled for control. Valtor turned, his sword slicing through the air to deflect a blow meant for her. Together, they pushed the man back, forcing him to retreat. The remaining slavers hesitated, their confidence shaken. One of them barked an order, and they regrouped, circling again. "Can you run?" Valtor asked Mira, his breath coming in short bursts. She nodded, her eyes still blazing with determination. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," he promised. Mira hesitated, but the urgency in his tone left no room for argument. She bolted toward the trees, her movements swift and agile despite her exhaustion. The slavers shouted in frustration, two of them breaking off to chase her. Valtor moved to intercept, his sword cutting a path through their ranks. He fought with a precision born of years of experience, his focus unshakable. Every strike was deliberate, every movement calculated. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. A sharp pain lanced through his side as one of the slaver's blades found its mark. He staggered, blood seeping through his shirt. Gritting his teeth, he swung his sword in a wide arc, forcing his attacker back. "Mira!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes wide as she saw him stumble. Without hesitation, she ran back toward him, her claws flashing as she leapt onto the nearest slaver. "Mira, no." Valtor tried to stop her, but she was already in the fray. Her claws tore through the man's armor, her movements wild and unrelenting. Together, they fought off the remaining attackers, the clearing falling silent as the last slaver fell. Valtor sank to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. Mira knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wound. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I'll live," Valtor replied, though his face was pale. Mira tore a strip from her tunic, pressing it against the wound to stem the bleeding. Her touch was gentle, her movements quick and practiced. "You shouldn't have come back," Valtor said, his voice low. "And let them kill you?" Mira snapped, her golden eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you behind." Valtor managed a faint smile despite the pain. "You're stubborn. And you're reckless?" She shot back, though her tone softened. "We need to move. There might be more of them." With her help, Valtor managed to stand, leaning heavily on her for support. They left the clearing behind, the forest closing in around them once more. As they walked, Myra's arms stayed firmly around his waist, her strength keeping him upright. Despite the danger, Valtor couldn't help but feel a flicker of warmth at her closeness, her determination to protect him as fiercely as he had protected her. By the time they found another place to rest, the sun was sinking low, painting the forest in hues of orange and gold. Mira guided Valtor to a fallen log, easing him down with care. She knelt beside him, checking his wound again. "You're going to be fine," she said firmly, her gaze meeting his. "I won't let anything happen to you." Valtor reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. Myra's ears flicked back, a faint blush coloring her cheeks beneath her fur. She didn't pull away, her hand lingering in his. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, the weight of their shared struggle pulling them closer. But the sound of distant footsteps shattered the moment, reminding them of the danger still lurking. "We'll face it together," Mira said, her voice steady. Valtor nodded, gripping his sword as he prepared for whatever came next. The forest grew denser as Valtor and Mira pushed forward, the canopy above weaving a thick tapestry that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was damp, filled with the rich scent of moss and earth. Valtor leaned heavily on Mira as they navigated the uneven terrain, his strength waning with each step. "You need to rest," Mira said, her voice tinged with worry. Her arm was firmly around his waist, supporting him as they moved. Not yet, Valtor replied, his voice low but resolute. If we stop now, they'll catch us. Mira glanced over her shoulder, her ears twitching at every faint sound. She had sharper senses than him, but the forest was alive with noise, making it hard to tell if they were being followed. You're no good to either of us if you collapse, she argued, pulling him to a halt beneath a cluster of towering pines. Let me check your wound again. Valtor didn't protest this time. He sank onto a fallen log, his hand instinctively pressing against his side. Mira knelt in front of him, carefully unwrapping the makeshift bandage she had tied earlier. Her brow furrowed as she inspected the injury, her touch gentle despite the urgency of the situation. It's not as bad as I thought, she said, though her tone was more to reassure herself than him. But you've lost a lot of blood. You can't keep pushing like this. Valtor watched her as she worked, her concentration unwavering. The sunlight filtered through the trees, catching in her fur and giving her an almost otherworldly glow. He could feel the warmth of her hands even through the fabric of his shirt, her closeness a strange comfort despite the pain. You're good at this, he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Mira looked up, her golden eyes meeting his. You learn a lot when survival depends on it, she replied, her tone neutral. But there was a flicker of something in her gaze, pain, or perhaps the memory of it. Valtor reached out, his hand brushing against hers. I'm sorry, he said, his words carrying a weight that went beyond the moment. Myra's ears flattened slightly, her expression softening. You don't have to apologize. None of this is your fault. Maybe not, Valtor admitted, but I know what it's like to carry scars that don't heal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the sounds of distant birds and rustling leaves fading into the background. Myra's hand lingered in his, her claws lightly grazing his skin. We should keep moving, she said finally, breaking the stillness. But her voice was softer now, less guarded. Valtor nodded, letting her help him to his feet. They resumed their journey, the tension between them shifting into something unspoken but undeniable. As they moved deeper into the forest, the terrain began to change. The ground sloped downward, leading them toward a shallow ravine. A narrow stream ran through its center, the water cool and clear as it wound its way over smooth stones. This will buy us some time, Valtor said, gesturing to the stream. If we follow it, it'll cover our tracks. Mira nodded, already stepping into the water. She turned to offer him her hand, and he took it without hesitation, the touch grounding him as they waded downstream. The cold water stung his wound, but he grit his teeth and pressed on. The ravine walls grew steeper as they followed the stream, the forest rising high above them. The narrow space offered some protection, but it also made escape more difficult if they were cornered. Valtor's grip tightened on his sword as they walked, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. Do you think they'll follow us here? Mira asked, her voice low. They'll try, Valtor said, but they're not as familiar with the land as we are now. That's our advantage. Mira glanced at him, her ears flicking forward. You say we, like I know what I'm doing. You're still alive, aren't you? Valtor replied with a faint smile. Mira huffed, but there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Barely. They continued in silence for a while, the stream guiding them through the ravine. The sound of rushing water filled the space, a soothing backdrop to their steady pace. But the quiet didn't last. A faint noise reached Valtor's ears, a low, distant growl that sent a chill down his spine. He stopped, holding up a hand to signal Mira to do the same. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira nodded, her ears swiveling toward the sound. It's close. Valtor drew his sword, the metal gleaming faintly in the dappled light. Stay behind me. Mira didn't argue this time, her claws flexing as she prepared to defend herself if necessary. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the ravine like a warning. A shadow moved in the trees above them, and Valtor's heart raced. Whatever it was fast, too fast for him to track easily. He tightened his grip on his weapon, his body tense and ready. The creature appeared suddenly, leaping from the rocks above to land in front of them with a heavy thud. It was massive, its fur bristling and its eyes glowing with a predatory light. A dire wolf, larger than any Valtor had ever seen. The beast bared its teeth, its growl rumbling like thunder. Mira took a step closer to Valtor, her tail lashing behind her. "Don't move," Valtor said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The wolf lunged, its jaws snapping inches from Valtor's sword as he swung it upward. The blade bit into the creature's shoulder, but it barely seemed to slow. It twisted, its claws raking toward him. Mira darted to the side, her movements quick and precise. She slashed at the wolf's flank, drawing its attention for just a moment. It turned on her with a snarl, and Valtor took the opportunity to strike again. The fight was brutal and chaotic, the narrow space of the ravine leaving little room for error. Mira moved like lightning, her agility keeping her just out of the wolf's reach. Valtor's strikes were heavier, each one calculated to weaken the beast. Finally, with a final, desperate lunge, Valtor's blade found its mark. The wolf let out a deafening howl before collapsing, its massive body hitting the ground with a resounding thud. Panting, Valtor leaned on his sword for support. Mira crouched nearby, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "You okay?" Valtor asked, his voice rough. Mira nodded, her golden eyes still wide with adrenaline. "I'll live," he said, though the exhaustion in his voice was evident. They both sat for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over them. The forest was quiet again, the tension in the air slowly fading. "We should move," Mira said eventually, her voice breaking the silence. Valtor nodded, pulling himself to his feet. Together, they continued down the stream, the bond between them stronger than ever as they prepared for whatever lay ahead. The stream led Valtor and Mira to a clearing tucked deep within the forest, a secluded haven where the sun broke through the canopy in golden streaks. Valtor collapsed against a moss-covered boulder, his breaths labored. Mira crouched beside him, her ears swiveling to pick up any sounds of pursuit. When she was satisfied they were alone, she knelt closer, examining him with concern. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "That wound isn't going to heal if you keep acting like it's not there." Valtor gave her a weak smile, his face pale. "Not much choice, is there? Besides, you did good back there." Mira frowned, her golden eyes narrowing. "Flattery doesn't change the fact that you're injured." She gestured for him to sit up straighter. "Let me see it." Valtor sighed but obeyed, wincing as he peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt to reveal the bloodied bandage. Mira winced at the sight, her claws twitching slightly. "Stay still," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. She retrieved the small pouch of herbs and clean strips of cloth they'd scavenged earlier. As she worked, her touch was firm but careful, her claws grazing his skin in a way that made his breath hitch. "You've done this before?" Valtor observed, trying to distract himself from the sharp sting of the antiseptic herb paste. "I had to," Mira replied, her voice quieter now. "Slaves don't get luxuries like proper care. If you're hurt, you fix it yourself, or you don't make it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her past. Valtor watched her as she focused on her task, her ears drooping slightly, betraying the emotions she tried to hide. "You're not there anymore," he said softly. "You're free now." Mira paused, her hands stilling for a moment. Then she resumed, her movements a little gentler. "It doesn't feel real yet," she admitted. "Like any moment, I'll wake up and find myself back in chains." Valtor reached out, his hand covering hers. "You won't," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." Myra's gaze flicked up to meet his, her golden eyes shimmering with something unspoken. She didn't pull away, her hand remaining under his. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, the forest quiet save for the gentle rustle of leaves. "You're a stubborn fool," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Comes with age," Valtor replied, his own smile soft but genuine. Mira finished tying off the bandage and sat back, her tail curling around her legs. We should rest here for the night, she said, glancing at the sky. It's getting late, and you're in no condition to keep going. Valtor nodded, too exhausted to argue. Mira moved to gather firewood, her movements quick and efficient. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, a small fire crackled between them, casting flickering light across the clearing. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but the silence between them was heavier now. Valtor watched Mira as she stared into the fire, her ears twitching occasionally. She looked lost in thought, her usual sharpness softened. "Penny for your thoughts?" Valtor asked, breaking the quiet. Mira glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I was just thinking about what comes next. Escape first," Valtor said. "Then we figure it out." "Escape to where?" Mira asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "They'll keep hunting us. People like me don't just get to disappear." "People like you?" Valtor repeated, his brow furrowing. Mira gestured to herself, her claws flexing slightly. "I'm not human, Valtor. I'll never blend in. Everywhere I go, I'll be a target. You saw how those slavers looked at me. They don't see a person. Just something to sell." Valtor leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then we'll find a place where they can't follow. Somewhere you can be safe." Mira shook her head, her ears flattening. "Places like that don't exist." "They will," Valtor said firmly, "even if I have to carve one out myself." Mira stared at him, her expression softening despite herself. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Valtor hesitated, the words forming in his mind before he spoke. "Because no one should have to face this alone. And because you deserve better." Myra's ears twitched, a faint blush coloring her cheeks beneath her fur. She looked away, her tail flicking. "You're impossible," she muttered, though there was no malice in her tone. They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling softly between them. Eventually, Mira lay down on the grass, her head resting on her folded arms. Valtor remained sitting, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he kept watch. "You should sleep," Mira said without opening her eyes. "You need it more than I do." Valtor chuckled softly. "Someone has to keep an eye out. I'll wake you if I hear anything," she promised, her ears twitching to emphasize her point. Reluctantly, Valtor lay back, his body protesting the movement. The stars overhead were bright and clear, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Despite the lingering tension, he felt a strange sense of peace. As sleep began to claim him, he glanced at Mira, her form bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The following morning, the forest stirred with the gentle sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. Mira was already awake, perched on a rock near the fire's remains, sharpening her claws with a small stone she had found. Her ears flicked as she noticed Valtor stirring, his groan betraying his stiffened muscles. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes scanning him with concern. "Like I fought a dire wolf yesterday," Valtor replied, managing a wry smile as he sat up. He touched his side gingerly. The pain was duller now, thanks to Myra's care, though it still pulled with every movement. "You kept watch all night?" She shrugged, the motion fluid and dismissive. "I don't need as much sleep as you do." Valtor frowned but didn't press the issue. He knew Myra's vigilance wasn't just about protecting them from threats. It was a habit born from years of needing to guard herself. They broke their fast with some dried fruit and roots Mira had foraged, the simple meal shared in companionable silence. When they were ready to move, Mira paused, her golden eyes meeting his. "We should head north," she said. "The terrain there is rougher, easier to hide." Valtor nodded, trusting her instincts. They set off, the forest thickening as they moved deeper into the untamed wilderness. The air grew cooler, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in shifting patterns. The sense of isolation was both a comfort and a reminder of the dangers they still faced. As they climbed a rocky incline, Myra's ears twitched suddenly, and she held up a hand to stop Valtor. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. "What is it?" he whispered. "Voices," she murmured, her ears swiveling toward the sound. Up ahead, they crouched low, moving slowly until the terrain allowed them a vantage point over a narrow valley below. A small group of slavers had set up a makeshift camp, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. The sight of their tattered uniforms and cruel laughter sent a surge of anger through Valtor. "They're still looking for you," he said grimly. Myra's claws flexed, her tail lashing behind her. "They won't stop until they're sure I'm dead, or back in chains." Valtor studied the camp, his mind racing. There were 5 men, all armed, though their attention seemed more focused on their meal and idle chatter than their surroundings. "We can't just leave them here," he said, his voice low. "If they keep searching, they'll find our trail eventually." Mira turned to him, her expression hard. "You're still injured. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I decided to help you," Valtor replied. "And I don't plan on letting them take you back." For a moment, Mira stared at him, her gaze unreadable. Then she nodded, her ears flattening slightly. "Fine, but we do this smart. No heroics." Valtor smiled faintly. "Wouldn't dream of it." They worked out a plan quickly, using the uneven terrain to their advantage. Mira moved like a shadow, circling the camp with practiced stealth. Valtor positioned himself on a ledge overlooking the slavers, his sword drawn and ready. The attack began with a distraction. Mira tossed a rock into the bushes near the edge of the camp, drawing the men's attention. As they turned, Valtor leapt down, his blade catching the first man off guard. The clash of steel rang out, shattering the morning's calm. Mira darted in from the shadows, her movements swift and precise. Her claws tore through one slaver's weapon arm, disarming him before he could strike. She fought with a ferocity that left no doubt she was done running. Valtor, despite his injury, held his ground. Each swing of his sword was deliberate, every move calculated. Together, they worked in tandem, their unspoken understanding turning the chaos into a coordinated assault. When the last slaver fell, the clearing was eerily quiet. Mira stood over one of the fallen men, her breathing heavy, her claws stained. Valtor leaned against a tree, his sword still in hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Mira nodded, though her gaze lingered on the bodies for a moment longer. "They deserved worse," she said, her tone cold. Valtor didn't argue. Instead, he moved to search the camp, gathering supplies that could be useful: food, water, and a map marked with the slavers' intended routes. "We should move," Mira said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "More could be nearby." Valtor agreed, and they left the camp behind, their steps quick but careful. As they moved, Mira glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Put yourself at risk for me." "I did what needed to be done," Valtor replied. "You don't owe me anything." Myra's ears twitched, and she looked away, her tail flicking behind her. "Maybe not, but thank you." Their journey continued, the forest growing wilder and the terrain more treacherous. They spoke little, the weight of the morning's events hanging heavy between them. Yet, despite the danger, there was a newfound sense of solidarity in their silence, a bond forged in blood and fire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they reached a narrow gorge with a shallow cave nestled in its side. Mira inspected it carefully before deeming it safe enough for the night. The cave was small but dry, its walls lined with moss and lichen. Valtor sank onto a flat stone near the entrance, his exhaustion catching up with him. Mira busied herself with starting a fire, her movements methodical. When the flames flickered to life, she sat beside him, the warmth chasing away the evening chill. For a while, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the silence. "You're different," Mira said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Valtor glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Different how?" "From anyone I've met," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Most people, they wouldn't have cared. They would have looked the other way. I've seen too much to look away, Valtor said simply, and I couldn't leave you to face this alone. Mira turned to him, her golden eyes searching his face. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Valtor hesitated, the question catching him off guard. Because I believe in second chances, he said finally, and I believe you deserve one. Myra's ears lowered slightly, her expression softening. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it lingered. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity that needed no further explanation. The fire crackled between them, its light casting shadows on the cave walls. For the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, knowing the journey ahead would demand all their strength and trust. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs as Valtor and Mira pressed onward, their path winding along the rocky terrain. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, and with it came an oppressive quiet that made even Myra's sharp ears twitch uneasily. The slavers had been conspicuously absent for days, and while the reprieve should have been a relief, it only heightened their shared sense of foreboding. Mira stopped abruptly, holding up her hand. Valtor paused behind her, his sword ready in case of danger. What is it? He asked, his voice low. She sniffed the air, her tail stiff. Smoke, she murmured, glancing back at him. And it's close. Valtor's grip on his weapon tightened. Could be another camp. Or worse, Mira replied grimly. She crouched low, motioning for him to follow as she crept forward, her movements fluid and silent. They pushed through a dense thicket of shrubs and emerged on the edge of a steep drop, the view below offering a clear sight of the source. A sprawling encampment sprawled in the valley below, tents clustered around a massive bonfire. The banners of a notorious slaver syndicate fluttered in the wind, and figures moved through the camp. Armed guards, bound captives, and traders exchanging goods with grim efficiency. Myra's claws dug into the dirt as she gritted her teeth. They're expanding their reach, she muttered, anger lacing her words. This isn't just about me anymore. Valtor knelt beside her, his face dark with resolve. If we leave them, they'll only grow stronger, he said. But if we act now, we might be able to do some damage. Myra's ears flattened. You're injured. I'm fast. But there are too many of them. We don't need to take them all down, Valtor said, his tone measured. We just need to hit their supply lines, disrupt their operations enough to give the captives a chance to escape. Mira glanced at him, her golden eyes sharp with determination. You've got a plan? Always, he replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips despite the tension. The two spent the next hour scouting the perimeter of the camp, marking weak points and noting guard rotations. Myra's natural agility and heightened senses were invaluable, allowing them to remain undetected as they moved. By the time they returned to their vantage point, dusk had begun to fall, the camp's activity increasing as torches were lit. Valtor unfolded the crude map they'd taken from the previous slaver group, cross-referencing it with what they'd observed. The supply tent is here, he said, pointing to a spot near the edge of the camp. If we hit it hard and fast, it'll cause enough chaos for the captives to make a run for it. Mira nodded. And the bonfire? It's big enough to spread if we knock it over. Exactly, Valtor said. But we'll need to be quick. Once they realize what's happening, they'll come after us. Myra's tail flicked, a determined gleam in her eyes. Then we'd better not give them the chance. They waited until the camp had settled into a false sense of security, the guards growing lax in their routines. When the moment was right, they moved like shadows, slipping down into the valley under the cover of darkness. Mira led the way, her steps silent on the uneven ground. She reached the supply tent first, her claws making quick work of the fabric ties holding it together. Valtor followed, dousing the crates and barrels inside with oil he'd salvaged earlier. A single spark from Myra's flint was all it took to ignite the inferno. Flames roared to life, consuming the tent and its contents in seconds. Shouts erupted from the guards as the fire illuminated the night, casting chaotic shadows across the camp. Mira didn't hesitate, darting toward the bonfire at the center of the camp. She leapt onto the structure with feline grace, using her strength to shove a support beam out of place. The massive pile of burning wood collapsed, scattering embers in all directions. Flames licked at nearby tents, spreading quickly as the slavers scrambled to contain the blaze. Valtor, meanwhile, took advantage of the confusion to cut through the ropes binding several captives. "Go," he urged, his voice firm but quiet. "Head for the north ridge. It's the safest route." The freed captives nodded, their faces a mix of fear and hope as they slipped away into the night. The chaos drew more guards to the center of the camp, but Valtor and Mira worked together to keep them at bay. Valtor's sword flashed in the firelight, his strikes precise despite his injury. Mira moved with deadly grace, her claws a blur as she disarmed and incapacitated their attackers. But the tide was beginning to turn. More slavers poured into the camp, their numbers overwhelming. Valtor's breaths came in ragged gasps, his movements slowing as the strain of the fight took its toll. Mira noticed, her ears flattening. "We need to retreat," she called, her voice urgent. "Now." Valtor nodded, parrying one last attack before falling back. Mira covered his retreat, her lithe form darting between the slavers, her strikes calculated to buy them time. They reached the edge of the camp and sprinted into the forest, the shouts of their pursuers fading as the dense trees swallowed them. By the time they stopped, both were breathing heavily, their bodies aching from the exertion. "We did it," Valtor said, leaning against a tree. "The captives are free." Mira nodded, her expression unreadable as she wiped blood from her claws. "But they'll come after us now. They won't let this go." Valtor met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "Then we keep moving. Together." Myra's ears twitched, her tail flicking behind her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying an unspoken depth. Valtor smiled, despite the exhaustion weighing on him. Always. The forest around them was silent again, the only sound the distant crackle of the dying fire. As they prepared to move once more, the bond between them felt stronger than ever, a shared determination to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The final showdown came with the rising sun, its golden light casting long shadows over the rugged cliffs. Valtor and Mira stood side by side at the edge of a rocky plateau, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. Below them, the remnants of the slavers' forces gathered, their numbers smaller but no less determined. The raid on the camp had weakened their operations but had not destroyed them entirely. Now they sought revenge. Mira crouched low, her claws glinting in the light. "They won't stop until one of us is gone," she said, her voice calm but tinged with resolve. Valtor adjusted his grip on his sword. His shoulder still ached from the previous fight, but he ignored the pain. "Then we make sure it's them," he replied, meeting her gaze. Together, the slavers advanced, climbing the rocky slope with weapons drawn. Their leader, a hulking figure clad in iron armor, barked orders from the rear, his voice booming. "Capture them alive if you can. Kill them if you must." Valtor took a step forward, raising his blade. "Stay close," he said over his shoulder. Mira grinned despite the tension in the air. "I'm not going anywhere." The first wave of attackers charged, their footsteps thundering against the rock. Valtor moved to meet them, his sword flashing in the sunlight. His strikes were precise, every movement honed by years of experience. Mira darted around him, her agility unmatched as she weaved through the chaos, her claws cutting down opponents with deadly efficiency. Despite their combined strength, the odds were stacked against them. The slavers pressed forward relentlessly, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm. Valtor and Mira fought back to back, their movements synchronized as if they had been fighting together for years. At one point, a particularly fierce blow from an enemy's mace knocked Valtor to his knees. Mira was there in an instant, her claws raking across the attacker's face as she growled fiercely. She knelt beside Valtor, her hand brushing against his arm. Are you hurt? Nothing I can't handle, he said, forcing himself to his feet. His gaze softened as he looked at her. Thanks. She gave him a small nod, her tail flicking behind her. Let's finish this. The fight dragged on, each moment feeling like an eternity. Just when it seemed the tide might turn against them, a sudden roar echoed across the cliffs. Both sides froze as the ground beneath them trembled. From the shadows of a nearby cave emerged a massive beast, a creature of fur and muscle, with piercing eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. It was one of Myra's kin, a long-lost guardian of the wilderness. Myra's breath caught in her throat. It's a sentinel, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. The beast charged into the fray, its powerful form scattering the slavers like leaves in a storm. Valtor and Mira used the distraction to regroup, their attacks more calculated as they worked to drive the remaining slavers toward the cliff's edge. The leader of the slavers roared in frustration, charging toward them with his weapon raised. Valtor stepped forward to meet him, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. The fight was brutal, every strike a test of strength and will. Mira watched, her claws flexing as she waited for the right moment to intervene. When the slaver leader raised his sword for a final blow, she sprang forward, her claws raking across his arm. He stumbled, his weapon falling from his grasp, and Valtor seized the opportunity to end the fight. The leader fell to the ground, defeated, his forces scattered. The sentinel let out a low growl, its massive form retreating into the shadows as the battle ended. Valtor lowered his sword, his chest heaving with exertion. Mira stood beside him, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. It's over, she said softly. He turned to her, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. For now, the two made their way to the edge of the plateau, the morning light warming their battered bodies. Valtor sat down heavily, his back against a rock, and Mira joined him, her tail curling around her legs. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their journey settling over them. Finally, Mira broke the quiet. You didn't have to do all this, you know, she said, her voice soft. You could have left me back there. Valtor glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had. You deserve a life free from chains. Her ears twitched, and she looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. You're not like anyone I've ever known. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. I could say the same about you. She shifted closer, her arm brushing against his. So, what happens now? Valtor leaned his head back against the rock, his gaze fixed on the sky. We keep going. Find somewhere safe. Somewhere we can start over. Mira smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Together. He turned to her, his expression softening. Always. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the forest below. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of a future forged in trust and resilience. As the sun climbed higher, Valtor reached out, his hand brushing against Myra's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. For the first time, neither felt alone.